Sterling-Howe IV stood on the rain-slicked curb, shivering, clutching a cardboard box of his accomplishments. While I sat in his private mahogany office, erasing his family name from the city skyline, they called Dr. Seraphina Vane a harmless paper pusher. Sterling laughed when he bulldozed her veterans clinic for a luxury skyscraper. He thought he was crushing a woman. He was actually triggering a legal landmine buried since 1912. Seraphina adjusted her Obsidian Lily Brooch. The matte black stone didn't reflect the camera flashes. Neither did her eyes. She didn't seek revenge. She sought tidal automatic reversion. Sterling made one mistake. He forgot to read the ground lease deed, a document that proved he didn't even own the dirt beneath his feet. In the next few minutes, you will witness the precise surgical removal of a billionaire. This is not a story of luck. It is a masterclass in systemic destruction. Pay attention. You might need these moves one day. The air in the Grand Crystal Ballroom smelled of gardenias and calculated desperation. It was the annual Autumn Gala, a room filled with the scent of expensive sandalwood and the soft, rhythmic clinking of crystal flutes. Dr. Seraphina Vane stood near the velvet-draped balcony. She was a vision of mahogany skin and absolute structural precision. Her hair was pulled back into a sculpted architectural bun. Not a single strand dared to defy the gravity of her will. She wore a bespoke cream silk blouse that shimmered under the chandeliers like liquid moonlight. Over it, a charcoal blazer with shoulders sharp enough to cut through a corporate board. On her left lapel, the Obsidian Lily Brooch anchored her presence. The matte black stone swallowed the light of the room. Only the single canary diamond at its center flickered. A golden eye watching the room, Seraphina felt the weight of the brooch against her chest. It was a cold, heavy reminder of why she was here. She wasn't here to dance. She wasn't here to network with the elite who thought they owned the city's heartbeat. She was here because the predator had finally decided to show his teeth. Across the room, Sterling Sterling-Howe IV moved like a shark through shallow water. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed. His tuxedo cost more than the annual budget of the veterans clinic he was trying to destroy. He was a fourth-generation predator, a man who believed that history was something you bought, and that people were something you leased. He began to walk toward her. The crowd parted. There was a shift in the room's temperature. The string quartet seemed to fade into a dull, distant hum. Seraphina did not move. She did not reach for her champagne. She simply waited. Her mahogany skin remained matte and flawless. Her pulse was a steady, ghostly rhythm. She watched Sterling's reflection in a nearby silver tray before she looked at the man himself. Sterling reached her. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't offer a greeting. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a heavy, cream-colored envelope. The Aegis Global Infrastructure seal was stamped in wax at the center. He held it out between two fingers, a gesture of supreme arrogance. "This is your formal notice of eviction, Seraphina." His voice was a smooth, Ivy League rasp. It carried the weight of a man who had never been told no. The zoning board met in an emergency session 2 hours ago. The St. Jude Veterans Wing has been declared a public hazard. Structural negligence. Your late mentor's legacy is officially a liability to the city. We begin the demolition at dawn. Sterling leaned in closer. His breath smelled of expensive scotch. It's cool and triumph. You have until midnight to clear out your desk, though I imagine you'll spend most of that time crying. The room went silent. The elite guests froze. They waited for the breakdown. They waited for the pleas for mercy. They waited for Seraphina to blink. She did not. Her eyes, sharp and dark, remained locked on his. She didn't look at the envelope. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked through Sterling, as if he were a glass partition that needed cleaning. Seraphina reached out. Her hand was steady. Her fingers brushed the edge of the envelope. But she didn't take it immediately. Instead, she reached up and adjusted the Obsidian Lily Brooch on her lapel. The movement was slow, deliberate. The canary diamond caught a stray beam of light, flashing a warning directly into Sterling's eyes. Sterling, your timing is as predictable as your tailoring." Her voice was a low, rich contralto. It didn't shake. It didn't rise. It possessed the weight of a gavel hitting marble. "You speak of structural negligence. Yet you are standing in a room built by my grandfather. You speak of liability. Yet you are currently trespassing on a narrative you don't yet understand." She took the envelope. She didn't open it. She held it as if it were a piece of discarded trash. Sterling laughed. "A dry, brittle sound. Narratives don't win in court, Seraphina. Deeds do. And Aegis Global owns the deed to that land. We own the soil. We own the air above it. And by tomorrow morning, we will own your silence." He turned to walk away, expecting the final word, expecting her to crumble behind him. Seraphina watched his back. She felt the cold texture of the obsidian lily under her thumb. She thought about the 1912 records she had spent 3 months digitizing in secret. She thought about the specific definition of public healing, written in the original sovereign land grant. Sterling believed he was taking a building. He didn't realize he had just stepped into a snare that had been set a century before he was born. "Sterling," she called out his name, just loud enough to stop him in his tracks. He turned back, a smirk playing on his thin lips. "The law is a magnificent architecture, if you understand how the foundation is laid." She took a sip of her champagne, the first movement she had made since he arrived. "I hope you kept the receipt for those demolition crews. You are going to need a refund for the equipment you won't be allowed to use." Sterling's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. Just a flicker. But Seraphina saw it. She saw the first crack in the ivory tower. He scoffed and walked away, disappearing into the sea of silken shadows. Seraphina stood alone. The envelope felt heavy in her hand, but her mind was light. She wasn't thinking about the eviction. She was thinking about fiduciary duty. She was thinking about the reversionary interest clause that was currently ticking. Like a time bomb in the city archives, she reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out her phone. She sent a single 3-word message to her legal team. The trap is set. She looked back at the Obsidian Lily Brooch. The black stone seemed deeper now, more absolute. Sterling thought he had served her a death warrant. In reality, he had just handed her the key to his own cage. The gala continued. The music swelled. The elite laughed and drank. None of them realized that the ground beneath the ballroom had just shifted. Seraphina walked toward the exit. Her heels clicked against the marble. Each step was a heartbeat. Each step was a countdown. She didn't need to stay for the party. The real work began in the dark. As she stepped out into the rainy night, the cool air hit her mahogany skin. She looked up at the towering skyscrapers of the city. Most of them bore the Sterling-Howe name. By this time tomorrow, those signs would be coming down. She stepped into her waiting car. The door closed with a heavy, substantial thud, the sound of a vault locking shut. She pulled the eviction notice from the envelope. She didn't read it. She folded it into a small, precise square. She tucked it into the console. A souvenir from the man who thought he was a king. Seraphina Vane was not a queen. She was the architect, and architects knew exactly which brick to pull to make the whole world come crashing down. The car pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the neon-lit rain. The silence in the back seat was absolute. It was the silence of a predator who didn't need to growl. The checkmate had already happened. Sterling Sterling-Howe IV just hadn't felt the blade yet. The sun rose over the city like a bruised orange, filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Dr. Seraphina Vane's penthouse. The light was cold, clinical. It struck the edge of her glass desk and shattered into 1,000 tiny needles of glare. Seraphina sat perfectly still. Her mahogany skin looked like polished wood in the morning glow. Her sculpted architectural bun was already in place. Every hair was a soldier standing at attention. She wore a charcoal blazer that felt like armor, underneath a cream silk blouse. The fabric was so fine it felt like a second skin. On her left lapel, The Obsidian Lily Brooch sat in the shadows. Its matte black petals absorbed the morning sun, but the canary diamond at its center was awake. It burned with a fierce, golden intensity. It was the only thing in the room that seemed to be breathing. On the 6-inch screen mounted to the wall, the morning news cycle was beginning. The headline scrolled across the bottom in a violent, urgent red dot: architect of fraud. The Vane scandal deepens. The news anchor was a man named Marcus Thorne. He was a veteran of the industry with a voice like gravel and honey. He looked into the camera with a practiced, graveyard solemnity. "New documents have surfaced this morning," Thorne began. His tone was heavy with manufactured disappointment. The St. Jude Veterans Wing, once hailed as a masterpiece of modern healing, may have been built on a foundation of lies. Internal memos suggest that Dr. Seraphina Vane bypassed safety protocols, trading structural integrity for aesthetic vanity. Sources close to Aegis Global Infrastructure claim that Vane knowingly used substandard materials to pad her own pockets. Seraphina watched. She didn't flinch. She didn't reach for the remote. Her high-arched brows didn't even twitch. She simply observed the destruction of her reputation as if she were watching a documentary on a foreign species. The pulse in her neck was a slow, rhythmic throb, 60 beats per minute. The heart rate of a woman who had already seen the end of the movie. Sterling Sterling-Howe IV appeared on the screen next. He was standing in front of the construction site, his silver hair catching the wind. He looked like a savior, a man burdened by the weight of public safety. "It is a tragedy," Sterling said. His eyes were damp with performative grief. "We trusted Dr. Vane. The city trusted her. But when Aegis Global took over the management of the district, we found the rot. We found the shortcuts. We cannot allow a ticking time bomb to stand in our community. We have no choice but to clear the site and start over. For the people." The screen cut back to a map showing Seraphine's other projects. Each one was being flagged with a yellow caution icon. The smear was systematic. It was global. It was designed to ensure that no bank would ever lend to her again. No client would ever call. No door would ever open. Sterling was trying to erase her from the future. Seraphina stood up. Her movement was fluid, economical. She walked to the window and looked down at the city. The streets were already humming with the traffic of people who believed what they were told. She touched the Obsidian Lily Brooch. The cold volcanic stone was a grounding force. She felt the sharp edge of the canary diamond under her fingertip. Sterling believed in the power of the image. He believed that the one who controlled the television controlled the truth. It was an old money mistake, a fourth-generation error. He thought the media was a weapon he could wield because he played golf with the owners. He didn't understand the plumbing of the industry. Seraphina walked back to her desk. She picked up a thick, leather-bound folder. It wasn't filled with architectural blueprints. It was filled with non-performing loan agreements. She opened it. The paper was crisp. The scent of ink and old debt filled the air. 3 months ago, Seraphina had noticed a pattern in the financial filings of the Global News Network, the parent company of the station currently calling her a fraud. They had over-leveraged themselves during a failed merger. They had taken on a massive amount of mezzanine financing. The debt had been sliced, diced, and sold into the secondary market. It was considered toxic. It was considered a liability to everyone else. It was a failing asset. To Seraphina, it was a master key through a series of offshore shell companies. Seraphina had quietly acquired 85% of the network's senior debt. She didn't own the building. She didn't own the cameras. She owned the right to declare the network insolvent. She looked at the clock. 8:59 a.m. In 60 seconds. The network's quarterly interest payment was due. A payment they could not make without a bridge loan from Aegis Global. A loan that Seraphina had blocked through a legal injunction filed at midnight. She picked up her phone. She dialed a number she had memorized weeks ago. The call was answered on the first ring. "This is the director's office," a voice said. Sharp and stressed. Put Marcus Thorne on the line, Seraphina said. Her voice was a calm, dark velvet. The director hesitated. Who is this? This is the woman who currently holds the deed to your broadcasting license, Seraphina replied. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end. The sound of a man realizing the floor had just vanished. 30 seconds later, the voice of Marcus Thorne came through the speaker. He sounded different. The gravel was gone. Only the fear remained. Dr. Vane? He whispered. Marcus, Seraphina said. She sat back in her chair, crossing one elegant leg over the other. I am looking at your balance sheet. It is a very poorly designed structure, much like the lies you are currently telling about my work. You have a massive liquidity crisis, and unfortunately, your savior, Sterling Sterling-Howe, is currently unable to help you, but I am. I am prepared to restructure your debt. I am prepared to forgive the missed payment. I am even prepared to inject fresh capital into your failing network. Thorne's breath hitched. What is the catch? The catch is the truth, Seraphina said. Her eyes narrowed. In 5 minutes. You are going to go back on the air. You are going to issue a retraction. Not just for the fraud allegations, but for the zoning board's involvement. You are going to present the evidence of the kickbacks Sterling paid to the city inspectors. I don't have that evidence, Thorne stammered. Check your private server, Marcus. I uploaded the bank transfers 10 minutes ago. Seraphina stood up. She walked back to the window. Sterling thought he was buying a smear campaign, Seraphina whispered. But he forgot one thing. You can't buy a weapon from someone who is already in foreclosure. On the screen, Marcus Thorne looked pale. He was listening to his earpiece. His eyes darted toward the side of the set. Seraphina watched as the red headline disappeared. The red was replaced by a cold, stark white. Breaking news. Aegis global corruption exposed. Seraphina leaned against the glass. The coldness of the window seeped into her forehead. She felt a flicker of something close to a smile. But it wasn't a smile of joy. It was the smile of a surgeon who had just removed a tumor. The phone on her desk began to ring. The caller ID showed a private number. She knew it was Sterling. She could almost smell his panic through the airwaves. She could picture him in his silk wallpapered office, realizing that the media machine he had built to crush her was currently turning its gears on him. She let it ring. She didn't need to speak to him. The screen was doing the talking for her. Every second that passed, another piece of the Sterling-Howe legacy was being dismantled. The public wasn't just hearing about the Veterans Clinic anymore. They were hearing about the offshore accounts, the safety violations in his other developments, the systemic greed of a man who thought he was untouchable. Seraphina reached up and adjusted the Obsidian Lily. The canary diamond caught the light and threw a golden spark against the charcoal of her blazer. She had spent her life building things that were meant to last, structures that could withstand the wind, the rain, the weight of time. Sterling only knew how to build illusions, and illusions had no structural integrity. She watched as the news anchor began to read the bank transfer details. The numbers scrolled past like a list of Sterling's scenes. Seraphina Vane didn't just survive the smear campaign. She turned it into a mirror, and for the first time in his life, Sterling Sterling-Howe IV was forced to look at what he really was, a man built on debt. Standing in a house of cards. The morning news was no longer about her. It was an obituary for the elite. Seraphina turned off the television. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a victory that didn't need an audience. She picked up her bag. She had a meeting at the city archives. The smear was over, but the reconstruction was just beginning. Sterling had tried to take her reputation now. She was going to take his foundation literally. She stepped out of her penthouse. The elevator doors closed with a soft, expensive hum. The hunt was no longer in the shadows. The hunt was in the light. The 88th floor of the Aegis Global Tower did not feel like a room. It felt like a vacuum. The air was pressurized, chilled to exactly 64 degrees. It smelled of ozone. polished glass, and the faint, metallic temps of unspoken threats. At the center of the room sat a table carved from a single slab of black obsidian. It was a mirror that reflected nothing but the cold, white lights of the ceiling. Dr. Seraphina Vane sat at the far end of the table. Her posture was a masterclass in geometric perfection. Her mahogany skin was flawless, a deep, rich tone that made the cream silk of her blouse look like a stroke of lightning. Her hair was slicked back into its sculpted architectural bun. Not a single fiber moved as the heavy, soundproof doors clicked shut behind her. She looked at the men and women seated around the obsidian slab. 7 board members, each one a titan of industry. Each one currently wearing the invisible leash of Sterling Sterling-Howe IV. They didn't look at her. They looked at their tablets, their gold watches, their own reflections in the table. They looked everywhere except at the woman whose empire they were about to dismantle. On Seraphine's left lapel, the Obsidian Lily Brooch was a dark anchor. The canary diamond at its center seemed to pulse with a hidden kinetic energy. It was the only thing in the room that felt alive. Sterling sat at the head of the table. He looked triumphant. His silver hair shimmered under the halogen lights. He adjusted his silk tie with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who had already won. Dr. Vane, Sterling began. His voice was a smooth, cultivated weapon. We are here to discuss the future of Vane architectural dynamics, or rather, its lack of one. He tapped a button on his console. A digital document appeared on the wall-sized screen behind him. It was a petition for involuntary dissolution. Section 4, Article 12 of our partnership agreement is quite clear, Sterling said. He leaned back, locking his fingers behind his head. If a lead partner is found to have committed acts of gross negligence that endanger the capital of the board may move for immediate liquidation. He looked around the room, a wolf checking on his pack given the recent news reports regarding your structural failures and the subsequent collapse of your credit rating. The board has reached a consensus. We are here to vote on the permanent dissolution of your firm. Your assets, your patents, and your remaining contracts will be absorbed by Aegis Global for a nominal fee. Seraphina didn't move. She didn't reach for the glass of water in front of her. She felt the coldness of the room seeping into her skin, but her internal temperature remained a steady, burning heat. She thought about the thousands of hours she had spent over drafting tables. She thought about the blueprints that were more than just lines. They were promises of safety. Sterling wasn't just stealing her money. He was trying to strip her name from the history of the city. The silence in the room stretched. It was heavy, suffocating. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Seraphina finally spoke. Her voice was low, like the vibration of a cello string. Sterling, you speak of bylaws as if they were holy scripture, but you have always had a problem with the fine print. She reached out, her hand moving with the precision of a surgeon. She touched the Obsidian Lily Brooch. The matte surface was cold, reassuring. Sterling laughed, a dry, brittle sound that didn't reach his eyes. The fine print is exactly why you are losing, Seraphina. We have 7 board members present, myself included. That constitutes a supermajority. The vote is a formality. You are out. Seraphina leaned forward. The movement was slight, but the entire board seemed to recoil. A quorum, Sterling, requires more than just bodies in chairs. It requires eligible voters. Sterling's smirk didn't vanish, but it tightened. What are you talking about? Seraphina looked at the man sitting to Sterling's right. Arthur Vance, a man who owned half the shipping docks in the tri-state area. Arthur, Seraphina said. Her voice was a soft, deadly caress. How is your daughter's trust fund? Arthur Vance went pale. His mahogany-toned skin turned a sickly, ashy gray. He looked at Sterling, then back at Seraphina. I don't see how that is relevant. Arthur, Stammered, it is relevant because of a specific clause in the Aegis Global Charter, Seraphina said. She didn't look away from him. Any board member currently facing an undisclosed fiduciary default is automatically stripped of their voting rights in a dissolution hearing. She turned her gaze back to Sterling 40-8 hours ago. A specific debt held by the Vance estate was purchased by a private equity group called the Lily Foundation. That debt was called in immediately. Arthur is currently in a state of technical insolvency. Sterling slammed his hand onto the obsidian table. The sound echoed like a gunshot. That's a lie. Arthur is one of the wealthiest men in this city. Wealth is an illusion built on credit, Sterling Seraphina said. Her voice remained perfectly level. And Arthur's credit just vanished. She shifted her gaze to the woman at the end of the table. Alina Rossi, the queen of urban development. Alina, your recent acquisition in the West End was funded through a series of offshore bridge loans. Loans that were collateralized by your shares in this very board. Alina Rossi froze. Her hand trembled as she reached for her tablet. Those loans were handled through a third-party escrow. Alina whispered. An escrow that was managed by a subsidiary of the same foundation. Seraphina said. She sat back. The canary diamond in her brooch flashed with a sudden, blinding brilliance. As of 8 a.m. this morning, both Arthur and Alina are in violation of the Fiduciary Integrity Clause. Their votes are voidable. Sterling stood up. His face was no longer smooth. The mask of Ivy League arrogance was cracking, revealing the frantic predator underneath. This is an ambush, he shouted. His voice cracked. No, Sterling, Seraphina said. This is an audit. She looked at the remaining board members. They were looking at each other now. The pack was no longer following the wolf. They were realizing the wolf was standing on a trapdoor. Without Arthur and Alina, you only have 5 votes. Seraphina continued. Her words were like falling stones. According to Article 12, a dissolution of a founding partner's firm requires a quorum of 6 eligible voters. You are 1 member short. Sterling, the silence that followed was different now. It was no longer the silence of the vacuum. It was the silence of a grave. Sterling looked around the room. He looked at Arthur. He looked at Alina. He looked at the empty chair at the far end of the table. Where's Harrison? Sterling hissed. Harrison isn't coming, Seraphina said. She stood up. Her charcoal blazer was sharp. Her presence filled the room until the 88 floors of the Aegis Tower felt small. Harrison is currently at the district attorney's office. He is explaining how you used the Veterans Clinic. Demolition to hide a $40 million tax shortfall. Sterling's knees seemed to give way. He sank back into his leather chair. The chair that cost more than a family car. It looked like a cage now. The board meeting is adjourned, Seraphina said. She didn't wait for a motion. She didn't wait for a second. She picked up her leather folder and walked toward the door. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, a steady, unyielding sound. She stopped at the door and turned back. Sterling was staring at the obsidian table. His reflection was distorted, broken. Sterling, she said. He looked up. His eyes were wide. BLOODSHOT. Next time you try to dissolve a foundation, make sure you aren't the one standing on the cracks. She walked out. The heavy doors swung shut. The vacuum was gone as she walked toward the elevator. Seraphina felt the pulse in her thumb. She touched the Obsidian Lily Brooch. It was warm now. It had absorbed the heat of the room. It had absorbed the victory. She wasn't finished. Sterling had tried to kill her. Firm in a boardroom. Now she was going to kill his legacy in the archives. She stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. The descent was fast. Smooth Seraphina Vane looked at her reflection in the gold-plated walls. She didn't see a victim. She didn't even see a survivor. She saw the architect of a new world, one where men like Sterling Sterling-Howe IV were nothing more than a footnote in a history of failure. The ground floor arrived. The doors opened. Seraphina walked out into the lobby. She didn't look back at the tower. She didn't need to. She knew exactly how much weight it would take to make the whole thing fall, and she was already holding the lever. Midnight in the city is not a time of rest. It is a time of transition. The humidity had broken, replaced by a sharp, pre-dawn chill that rattled the window panes of Seraphine's hidden satellite office. This was not a space of glass and chrome. It was a bunker of reinforced concrete and silent worry servers. The room smelled of ozone, cold coffee, and the heavy electric scent of high-speed data processing. Dr. Seraphina Vane sat in a hubbaked leather chair. Her mahogany skin was bathed in the flickering blue light of a dozen monitors. She looked like a digital deity presiding over a temple of secrets. Her hair remained trapped in its sculpted architectural bun, a symbol of her refusal to let the chaos of the night touch her. She wore a charcoal blazer over her cream silk blouse. Even in the dead of night, in a room no one was supposed to find, she was the embodiment of quiet luxury. On her left lapel, the Obsidian Lily Brooch anchored her to the present. The matte black volcanic stones seemed to draw the shadows of the room toward it. The canary diamond at its center flickered like a dying star, or a warning light. Seraphina reached up. Her fingers brushed the cold surface of the obsidian. She felt the sharp, precise edges of the carving. It was a reminder of her father's workshop. A reminder that even the hardest stone could be shaped if you knew where the pressure points were. Across from her, Marcus sat hunched over a keyboard. He was a forensic accountant who looked like he hadn't slept since the 1990s. His eyes were bloodshot, reflecting strings of emerald green code. "I found it, Seraphina," Marcus whispered. His voice was thin, brittle. He didn't look up. He pointed at a monitor that was displaying a complex web of shell companies, from the Cayman Islands to Luxembourg, from Delaware to the Isle of Man. Sterling wasn't just skimming profits, Marcus continued. He was running a wash sale loop on a global scale. He was using the Aegis Global Infrastructure Fund to buy back his own distressed debt through these ghost entities. Then he'd write off the losses against his domestic tax liabilities. Seraphina leaned forward. Her eyes narrowed. Her high-arched brows were set in a line of absolute concentration. "Show me the ghost ledgers," she commanded. Marcus hit a key. A new spreadsheet materialized. It was a work of dark art, a second set of books that detailed the true flow of capital. This was the institutional rot Sterling Sterling-Howe IV believed was buried. Under 100 layers of encryption, it was a clear violation of the Internal Revenue Code section 1091. More importantly, it was a breach of fiduciary duty on a scale that would trigger an automatic asset seizure by the federal authorities. Sterling was using the city's infrastructure budget, money meant for bridges, schools, and hospitals, to fund his own private survival. The ghost ledgers showed everything. The kickbacks to the zoning board, the offshore accounts used to pay for the smear campaign against Seraphina, and the specific payment to the demolition crew that had been instructed to ignore the structural safety of the Veterans Clinic. Seraphina felt a cold, hard knot of anger tighten in her chest. It wasn't the hot, messy anger of the weak. It was the cold, calculating anger of the architect who sees a flaw in the foundation. She looked at the total at the bottom of the ledger. $240 million. That is the price of his arrogance, Seraphina said. Her voice was a low, dangerous hum. She watched as the download progress bar hit 90%. This was the evidence that would turn Sterling's ivory tower into a prison cell. This was the checkmate. Logic that would bypass the bot judges and the corrupt police. It was a sovereign deed violation. The land was federal. The money was public. The crime was absolute. 95%. A small red light flickered on a separate monitor to her right. Seraphine's gaze shifted instantly. It was the security feed from the lobby. The building was supposed to be empty. The elevator was supposed to be locked on the ground floor. On the screen, a man in a dark, tactical windbreaker stepped into the elevator car. He didn't look like a common thief. He moved with a heavy, purposeful economy of motion. He didn't look at the camera. He looked at his watch. He pulled a silenced pistol from a concealed holster and checked the chamber. The elevator indicator began to climb. 1, 2, 3. Marcus didn't see it. He was too focused on the data. 98%, Seraphina, we're almost there, Marcus said. His voice was filled with a frantic, nervous energy. Once this hits the secure server at the DA's office, Sterling is done. He's finished. Seraphina didn't answer. She stood up. Her charcoal blazer didn't have a single wrinkle. She moved to the window and looked out at the rainy city. She wasn't looking at the view. She was looking at the reflection of the hallway behind her. The elevator reached floor 10. Then 12. The hitman wasn't here for the data. Sterling knew that once the audit started, the data was already gone. The hitman was here for the source. Sterling had finally realized that. Dr. Seraphina Vane was not a woman who could be bought or broken. She had to be erased, 99%. The elevator chime echoed through the silent building. It was a soft, polite sound, the sound of a guest arriving at a dinner party. The hitman stepped out onto the 20th floor. Seraphina reached up and touched the Obsidian Lily Brooch. She felt the canary diamond. It was warm from the heat of her body. Marcus, Seraphina said. Her voice was as calm as a frozen lake. Yeah, turn off your monitors. Now. Marcus looked up. He saw her face. He saw the cold, absolute resolve in her eyes. He didn't ask questions. He hit the master kill switch. The room plunged into darkness. The only light came from the rainy city skyline outside the window. The sound of footsteps approached. They were muffled by the carpet, but Seraphina could hear them. Each step was a countdown. Each step was a heartbeat. She didn't run. She didn't hide under the desk. She walked to the center of the room and stood in a patch of moonlight. Her mahogany skin was a silhouette of power. The Obsidian Lily Brooch caught a stray beam of light, flashing once, twice, like a lighthouse in a storm. The door to the office creaked open. The hitman entered. He kept low, the silenced barrel of his gun leading the way. He saw the figure in the center of the room. He raised the weapon. Wait, Seraphina said. The hitman froze. There was something in her voice. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a scream. It was a command. You should check your phone. Seraphina continued. Her voice was a dark, velvety silk. The hitman didn't move. The Lily Foundation made a deposit into your offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Seraphina said. It is exactly 3 times what Sterling Sterling-Howe IV promised you. The hitman's grip on the gun didn't waver, but his head tilted. Just a fraction of an inch. In exchange for that deposit. Seraphina said. You are going to do something very simple. She stepped closer. The moonlight hit her face. Her high-arched brows were raised in a question. You are going to go back to Sterling. You are going to tell him the job is done. And then you are going to give him this. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted flash drive. Tell him it's the only copy of the ledgers. Tell him he's safe. The hitman stared at her. He looked at the flash drive. Then he looked at the phone in his tactical pocket. It vibrated, a soft, persistent hum. He reached down with his left hand and pulled the phone out. He looked at the screen. His eyes widened. The transfer was there. A 7-figure sum. Verified, cleared, irrevocable. Seraphina watched him. She wasn't breathing hard. Her heart was a steady, unyielding drum. She had calculated the hitman's loyalty the same way she calculated the load-bearing capacity of a skyscraper. Everyone has a price. Sterling believed that price was fear. Seraphina knew that for a professional. The price was always freedom. The hitman slowly lowered the gun. He reached out and took the flash drive from her hand. His fingers brushed hers. They were cold. Hers were warm. Why? He whispered. Seraphina adjusted her Obsidian Lily Brooch. Because, she said, I want him to feel safe. I want him to be standing on the very top floor of his empire. When the foundation finally turns to dust. The hitman nodded. He didn't say another word. He faded back into the shadows of the hallway. The elevator chime echoed again. The indicator began to descend. Marcus let out a breath he had been holding for 3 minutes. He slumped over the desk, shaking Seraphina. He gasped. "You just paid a hitman to let us live, no," Marcus, Seraphina said. She walked back to the monitors and turned them on. The progress bar said, "Upload complete. I didn't pay him to let us live. I paid him to deliver the Trojan horse. That flash drive doesn't contain the ledgers. It contains a logic bomb that is currently being uploaded into the Aegis Global mainframe. By the time Sterling realizes what he's holding, his entire digital infrastructure will be under the control of the Federal Audit Team." She looked at the Obsidian Lily, the canary. Diamond was glowing in the light of the rebooting screens. Sterling thought he was sending a message. Seraphina said, "Now it's my turn to reply." She picked up her bag and walked toward the door. The midnight audit was over. The hunt was moving into the final phase, and Sterling Sterling-Howe IV is currently holding the detonator to his own destruction. The penthouse of the Sterling-Howe estate vibrated with the muffled, thumping bass of a celebration. The air was thick with the scent of vintage cognac, expensive Cuban cigars, and the intoxicating perfume of unearned victory. Sterling Sterling-Howe IV stood by the curved glass wall, looking down at the city lights like a king surveying a conquered territory. His silver hair caught the golden glow of the chandeliers. A glass of crystal-clear vodka sat in his hand. He watched the rain wash over the skyline, thinking about the flash drive currently sitting in his safe. He believed he had erased the threat. He believed Dr. Seraphina Vane was currently a ghost, haunted by the ruins of her reputation. Sterling took a sip. The liquid was cold, sharp, much like the satisfaction of watching a rival bleed out in the dark dot, while Sterling toasted to his own genius. 5 miles away, the reality of his empire was being dismantled. One document at a time, Seraphina Vane stood on a desolate, rain-slicked pier in the industrial district. The temperature had plummeted. The wind coming off the harbor carried the scent of salt, diesel fuel, and old, rusted iron. She was a silhouette of absolute mahogany precision against the gray, churning water. Her sculpted architectural bun remained defiant. Not a single drop of rain seemed to dare disturb the perfection of her hair. She wore a tailored charcoal trench coat over her blazer. The collar popped to shield her neck from the spray. On her left lapel, the Obsidian Lily Brooch was the only thing that didn't glisten. Its matte surface swallowed the flickering orange light of the nearby pier lamps. But the canary diamond at its center was a piercing golden eye. It looked like a spark of fire trapped in a block of ice. Seraphina checked her watch. A vintage piece with a face as dark as the harbor. A set of headlights cut through the fog. A black sedan approached, its tires crunching over the gravel and broken glass. It stopped 10 feet away. A man stepped out. Elias Thorne. He was a man who lived in the margins of the legal system, a broker of things that shouldn't exist. He smelled of damp wool and cheap mints. He looked at Seraphina with a mixture of greed and visible terror. "Dr. Vane," Elias said. His voice was barely a whisper against the wind. "I have them, but you're playing a dangerous game. Sterling thinks I'm working for him. If he finds out I'm selling to you..." "I'm a dead man." Seraphina didn't flinch. Her mahogany skin remained smooth. Her high-arched brows didn't move. She simply held out a gloved hand. "The deeds, Elias," she said. Her voice was a low, resonant frequency that cut through the sound of the waves. Elias reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy, waterproof envelope. He clutched it to his chest for a moment, hesitating. "The easements expired 40 years ago." He said, "They are worthless paper. Why would you pay millions for rights to land that the city already paved over?" Seraphina stepped forward. The movement was slow, predatory. She didn't look at Elias, she looked at the envelope. Because Elias, the city didn't pave over the land. They paved over the rights. She took the envelope. She didn't open it. She knew what was inside. These were the expired easements of the 1920 Infrastructure Act, a set of specific high-voltage utility corridors that ran directly beneath the foundation of the Aegis. Global Tower. Sterling believed that because the easements had expired, they were dead. He believed that the statute of limitations on land use had cleared the title. For his skyscraper, he was wrong. In the state's sovereign deed protocols, a utility easement for public essential services does not expire. It merely goes dormant. If the original grantors err the holder of the reversionary interest reactivates the claim through a notice of reentry. The current owner of the building becomes a TRESPASSER by purchasing these dormant rights from the descendants of the original 1920 landowners. Seraphina wasn't just buying paper. She was buying the right to turn off the lights. Literally. Elias watched her. He pulled a burner phone from his pocket. Small. Red light was blinking on the side. "I've done what you asked," he said. "I told Sterling you were trying to buy the coastal lot next to his house. I gave him the fake trail. He thinks you're desperate. He thinks you're trying to block his view." Seraphina touched the Obsidian Lily Brooch. The canary diamond caught a flash of lightning from the horizon. "Good. Let him focus on the view," she said. "While he looks at the horizon, he'll never notice the ground shifting beneath his feet." Elias nodded. He looked over his shoulder, nervous. "I'm leaving. Don't call me again." He scrambled back into his car. The engine roared to life. He sped away, disappearing into the fog. Seraphina stood alone on the pier. She felt the heavy weight of the envelope in her hand. This was the silent kill. Inside her mind, she was already calculating the timeline. The notice of reentry would be filed at the county recorder's office at 8 a.m. By 9 a.m., AC's and desist order would be served to the Aegis Global Maintenance Team. Sterling thought he was celebrating a victory over her reputation. He didn't realize he was currently a tenant at Sufferance. He was living in a 1,200-foot tall tower that he no longer had the legal right to occupy. Seraphina walked back toward her own vehicle. Her heels clicked against the wood of the pier. Each sound was a period at the end of a sentence. She sat in the back of the car. The interior was a sanctuary of black leather and silence. She pulled out a single sheet of paper from the envelope. It was a map of the city's underground grid. Red lines marked the easements she now controlled. They converged like a web directly under the Aegis Tower. She thought about her late mentor, the man Sterling had tried to blame for the structural failures. Her mentor had always told her that an architect's greatest tool wasn't the pen, it was the law. If you understand the bones of the earth, you can survive any storm. He had said. Seraphina traced the lines with her finger. She felt a cold, deep sense of satisfaction. Not for the money, not even for the revenge, but for the restoration of balance. Sterling Sterling-Howe IV believed that power was something you took. Seraphina knew that power was something you anchored. She looked out the window as the car pulled away. The rain was coming down harder now. The city was a blur of neon and gray. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. She looked at the photos Marcus had sent earlier, the ghost ledgers. The hitman had delivered the flash drive. Sterling was likely at this very moment feeling a sense of absolute security. He would believe the evidence against him was destroyed. He would believe the audit was dead. He would be at his most arrogant, his most vulnerable. Seraphina leaned her head back against the headrest. She closed her eyes. The shadow purchase was complete. The double agent had done his job. Sterling was looking at the wrong map. He was fighting the wrong war. Tomorrow morning, the elite would wake up to a world that looked exactly the same. But the foundation would be gone. Seraphina Vane was no longer just an architect. She was the landlord of the elite, and she was about to collect the rent. The car glided through the streets. A silent shadow in a city of noise. Seraphina felt the Obsidian Lily Brooch against her heart. It was a cold, heavy weight. A black heart for a black-hearted mission. She didn't need to celebrate. She didn't need champagne or cigars or the applause of SYCOPHANTS. She only needed the truth. And the truth was written in 1920. Ink. The countdown to the reversionary dawn had begun. Sterling had one more night of sleep. She would make sure it was the most expensive rest of his Life. The library of the Atherton Club was a mausoleum of dead secrets. The walls were lined with leather-bound volumes that no one ever read. Their spines were gold-leafed and cold. The air smelled of aged cedar, expensive Earl Grey, and the dry, dusty scent of old money. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The sun was a dying ember, casting long, sharp shadows across the Persian rugs. Dr. Seraphina Vane sat in a wingback chair that felt like a throne. Her mahogany skin was a deep, rich contrast to the cream silk of her blouse. Her sculpted architectural bun was a masterpiece of discipline. Not a single strand of hair defied the order of her presence. She wore her charcoal blazer, the structured shoulders giving her the silhouette of a monolith, on her left lapel. The Obsidian Lily Brooch sat in the dim light. The matte black stone was a silent, volcanic heart. The canary diamond at its center caught a stray beam of sunlight. It flared with a sudden, golden arrogance. A singular eye that refused to blink. Sterling Sterling-Howe IV sat across from her. He was trying to look relaxed. He had abandoned his tuxedo for a navy cashmere sweater and gray flannels. But his silver hair was too perfect. His smile was too wide. His hands were clasped over his knee. But Seraphina noticed the slight, rhythmic twitch in his left thumb. The predator was hungry, but he was also terrified. Between them, on a low marble table, sat a silver tray with a porcelain tea set and a single thick manila envelope. Seraphina, Sterling said. His voice was a practiced, low-frequency rumble. It was designed to soothe, to manipulate, to make a woman feel like she was being protected while her throat was being cut. The last 48 hours have been difficult for both of us. The media has turned this into a circus. The city is on edge. And frankly, we are both too important to spend our time in the mud. He leaned forward. His eyes were the color of cold steel. I am a man of reason. I acknowledge that perhaps Aegis Global moved too quickly with the zoning board. And I recognize that your reputation is your primary asset. I want to make this right. Seraphina didn't move. She didn't reach for the tea. She didn't even acknowledge his words with a nod. She simply watched him. Her high-arched brows were set in an expression of cold. Clinical observation. Go on, Sterling, she said. Her voice was a dark, velvety shadow. Sterling tapped the envelope. Inside is a settlement agreement. It includes a $20 million consultancy fee for your firm, payable immediately. It also includes a public statement from Aegis Global. We will claim the structural reports were misinterpreted by a junior analyst. We will take the blame. Your name will be cleared. He paused, waiting for the flicker of relief, waiting for the greed to take hold. In exchange, he continued, we simply sign a mutual release of liability. We both walk away. You get your clinic back. I get my skyscraper. And we never have to see each other's faces in a courtroom. Sterling sat back, reaching for his teacup. The porcelain clinked softly against the saucer. A tiny sound that felt like a bell marking the end of a round. Seraphina reached out. Her hand was steady. Her fingers were long and elegant. She didn't touch the envelope. She reached for the silver tongs and picked up a single cube of sugar. She watched the sugar dissolve into her tea. Sterling, she said. Her voice was a whisper that filled the room. You have spent your entire life believing that everyone has a number. You think you are buying my silence? It's not silence, Seraphina. It's peace. Sterling replied. Seraphina picked up the envelope. She opened it with a slow, deliberate motion. The sound of the paper tearing was the only noise in the library. She began to read. She didn't look at the number. The $20 million was irrelevant. It was a distraction, a shiny object meant to keep her eyes off the foundation. She moved past the payment terms, past the public statement. She moved straight to the recital section on page 4. Her eyes narrowed. Her internal monologue began to dismantle the legalese. Sterling was a fourth-generation predator. He knew that the most dangerous traps aren't the ones that lock you in. They are the ones that make you walk in willingly. On page 4, section 8.2, under the heading of mutual indemnification. There was a sentence written in a font so standard it was invisible. The claimant acknowledges that any and all previous administrative filings by the respondent were based on the claimant's provided structural data. Seraphina felt a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline. It was a classic admission of guilt clause, disguised as a standard boilerplate for data sharing. If she signed this, she wasn't just taking $20 million. She was legally admitting that she had provided Sterling with the fraudulent structural data he used to justify the demolition. She would clear her name today, only to be arrested by the Federal Bureau of Investigation tomorrow. Sterling wasn't offering her a settlement. He was offering her a confession by taking his money. She would be confirming that she was the one who had defrauded the city. Sterling would be the victim, the man who had been tricked by a corrupt architect. He would keep his skyscraper. He would keep his reputation. And he would have her behind bars for the next 15 years. Seraphina looked up from the paper. Sterling was watching her over the rim of his cup. His eyes were expectant. There was a faint, ugly glint of triumph in his gaze. He thought she was desperate. He thought the audit and the media campaign had pushed her to the edge. He thought she was looking for a life raft. He didn't realize he was dealing with the woman who had built the boat. Sterling, Seraphina said. She placed the contract back on the table. Face down, your father was a much better lawyer than you are. Sterling's smile faltered. Excuse me, this contract is a masterpiece of deception. Seraphina continued. Her voice was a low, rhythmic hammer. Section 8.2. The indemnification trap. You didn't write this to end the war. You wrote this to ensure I was the only one who died in it. Sterling set his cup down. The tea splashed over the side. His silver hair seemed to lose its luster. I don't know what you're talking about. It's a standard release. It is an admission of guilt, Sterling, Seraphina said. She leaned forward. The moonlight was gone. The room was dark. The only thing glowing was the canary diamond in her. Obsidian Lily. It looked like a predatory eye in the night. You wanted me to sign my own death warrant? You wanted to use my desire for the clinic to blind me to the rope you were putting around my neck. She stood up. Her charcoal blazer was sharp, unyielding. She looked down at him, and for the first time, Sterling looked small. He looked like a child playing with a chemistry set he didn't understand. I am not interested in your $20 million. Sterling, Seraphina said, I am not interested in your false piece. She reached down and picked up her leather folder. You think the media is the threat. You think the audit is the threat. You think this contract is your shield. She adjusted the Obsidian Lily Brooch. The matte black stone felt like a cold, heavy truth against her chest. You forgot about the ground, Sterling. The Atherton Club is built on a land grant from 1890. It is a beautiful building. But like everything you touch, it is currently standing on a lie. Sterling stood up. His face was flushed, deep, angry, red. Get out, he hissed. You're done. You're finished in this town. You'll never work again. You'll be lucky if you're not begging on the street by Christmas. Seraphina walked toward the door. She didn't look back. Her heels clicked against the hardwood, a steady counting rhythm. Sterling, she said, stopping at the threshold. Check the lights. What? Check the lights in your tower. Sterling. She walked out into the cool evening air. The false peace was over. The diplomatic phase of the war was finished. As she stepped into her car, she looked up at the skyline. The Aegis Global Tower sat there, a needle of glass and ego. She pulled out her phone. She looked at the time stump on the notice of re-entry. She had filed earlier that morning. The clock had run out. Sterling thought he was playing chess. He thought he had trapped her queen. He didn't realize that Seraphina Vane had already set the board on fire. She touched the Obsidian Lily Brooch. The canary diamond was cold now. The hunt was moving into the infrastructure phase. The city was about to learn what happens when the architect stops supporting the weight of the elite. The car pulled away, disappearing into the shadows of the old money district. Inside the library, Sterling Sterling-Howe IV stood alone. He looked at the unsigned contract. The lights in the library flickered once, twice, then they went out. The command center was a tomb of silence, illuminated only by the rhythmic, ghostly pulse of server racks. Dr. Seraphina Vane stood at the center of the dark room. Her presence was an architectural fact. She was a pillar of mahogany and silk. Her sculpted architectural bun was pulled so tight it seemed to sharpen the very lines of her face. She wore a bespoke charcoal blazer, the fabric heavy and silent, underneath a cream silk blouse that shimmered like a warning on her left lapel. The Obsidian Lily Brooch was a black hole in the dim light. The canary diamond at its center caught the blue glow of a primary monitor. It didn't just reflect the light. It seemed to judge it outside the reinforced glass. The city was a sprawling, electric organism, a kingdom of light built on a foundation of stolen time. Seraphina looked at the Aegis Global Tower. It was the brightest needle in the haystacks of the skyline. It was Sterling's pride. It was his proof of existence. She felt the coldness of the room in her joints. But her hands were warm. Her pulse was a steady 45 beats per minute. She was not a woman in the middle of a crime. She was a woman in the middle of a restoration. Seraphina reached for the console. Her fingers moved with the grace of a concert pianist. She wasn't typing code. She was entering the legal identifiers. Of the expired easements she had acquired on the pier. The logic was ancient, irrefutable. Under the 1920 Infrastructure Act, the holder of a dormant utility easement has the absolute right to execute a maintenance stay if they can demonstrate a reasonable belief of structural instability. By filing the notice of reentry that morning, Seraphina had reactivated her status as the primary stakeholder of the land beneath the Aegis Tower now. She was exercising her fiduciary duty to the public. She hit the final key. The command sent was not a digital hack. It was a writ of mandamus delivered at light speed. It was a legal order to the city's power grid operators. It informed them that the high-voltage lines running through the 1920 corridor were now under a mandatory safety inspection stay. Grid had no choice but to comply. To ignore the stay would be to invite a multi-billion-dollar litigation suit that the city's insurance could never cover. Seraphina watched the screen dot in the distance. The Aegis Global Tower flickered. It was a subtle thing at first, a momentary dip in the brilliance of the upper floors. Then, a ripple of darkness moved down the spine of the building. The elevators stopped. The climate control died. The digital security gates locked in their current positions. Sterling's empire was breathing its last dot. The silence in the command center was suddenly broken by a low, distant hum. It was the sound of the city's backup generators struggling to compensate for the sudden load shift. Seraphina didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply watched as the darkness swallowed Sterling's office. She thought about the thousands of people currently trapped in the dark. She thought about the panic in the boardrooms. She knew that within minutes, Sterling would be screaming at his engineers. He would be demanding answers. He would be offering bribes to the grid operators. But there were no answers, only the law. And the law said that until the maintenance stay was lifted by the easement holder, the power could not be restored. Seraphina was the landlord of the electricity. She reached up and touched the Obsidian Lily Brooch. The matte black stone felt like the weight of the city itself. She felt the sharp point of the canary diamond. Under her thumb, everything has a price. Sterling, she whispered to the empty room. And tonight, you are paying the arrears. The internal monologue of her mind was a ledger of history. She saw the faces of the veterans who had been displaced. She saw the mentor who had been shamed. She saw the generations of people whose land had been paved over by the arrogance of the Howe family. She wasn't just turning off the lights. She was reversing a century of theft. A sudden, violent flash of red and blue light cut through the shadows of the office. Seraphina didn't turn around. She watched the reflection on the glass. 5 police cruisers had pulled up to the curb below. Their sirens were silent. but their lights were a frantic, visual scream. She heard the sound of heavy boots echoing in the hallway. The rhythmic, metallic clinking of tactical gear. The door to the command center burst open. 6 officers stepped in. Their weapons were drawn. But they weren't pointed at a criminal. They were pointed at a woman who was standing in a cream silk blouse, looking at the rain. Dr. Seraphina Vane. One of the officers shouted. His voice was strained, under heavy pressure. "You are under arrest for infrastructure sabotage and public endangerment." Seraphina slowly turned. Her movement was a study in controlled gravity. She didn't raise her hands. She didn't cower. She simply stood her ground. Her mahogany skin looked like iron in the flickering police lights. "Infrastructure sabotage is a heavy charge, officer," she said. Her voice was a low, resonant velvet. It carried no fear, only the weight of absolute authority. "I assume you have a warrant that supersedes the 1920s Sovereign Infrastructure Act?" The officer hesitated. He looked at his partner, then back at the woman who looked like she owned the air he was breathing. "We have an emergency order, signed by Chairman Sterling-Howe." The officer said. His grip on his weapon tightened. "Sterling-Howe is a private citizen," Seraphina replied. Her eyes were sharp, dark, and entirely unimpressed. "He does not sign warrants. He signs checks. And as of 10 minutes ago, his checks are being held in escrow due to an institutional liquidity stay." She walked toward the officers. Not a single one of them moved to stop her. She possessed the kind of quiet luxury that made violence feel like a social faux pas. She stopped 3 feet away from the lead sergeant. She adjusted the Obsidian Lily Brooch on her lapel. The canary diamond caught the red light of the cruisers. It looked like a drop of blood in the center of a black flower. "If you take me into custody, officer, you will be interfering with a court-ordered safety inspection of a public utility," Seraphina said. "That is a federal offense. It carries a mandatory minimum of 20 years. She leaned in, just enough for the officer to smell the faint, expensive scent of her sandalwood perfume. "Are you prepared to go to prison for a man who can no longer pay your pension?" The room went silent. The only sound was the heavy breathing of the officers and the distant, muffled chaos of the city outside. Seraphina could see the doubt in the sergeant's eyes. He wasn't a bad man. He was a tool that had been told he was doing the right thing. But Seraphina was showing him the edge of the blade. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a single, laminated document. "This is the writ of maintenance," she said. "It has been filed with the Department of Energy. It has been verified by the state attorney. If you arrest me, you are stopping a safety check on a grid that is currently leaking $40 million of public funds into Sterling's offshore accounts." She looked at each officer in turn. Her high-arched brows were a challenge. "I am not leaving this room because I am a criminal. I am leaving this room because I have a hearing in front of the district court in 1 hour." She picked up her leather folder from the desk. "You can escort me to the courthouse if you wish, but you will not handcuff me. And you will not touch my brooch." The sergeant lowered his weapon. He looked at the document. Then he looked at the Aegis Tower, which was now a dark, nameless ghost against the clouds. "Let's go," he said to his men. Seraphina walked out of the command center. She was flanked by 6 armed men, but she looked like she was leading a parade. As she stepped out into the rain, the cold water hit her face. It was refreshing. It felt like the first clean thing in a city full of filth. She stepped into the back of a police cruiser, not as a prisoner, but as a sovereign power. The lights flickered across the city. The grid was unstable. The elite were in a panic. The foundations were crumbling. Seraphina Vane sat in the back seat of the car. She looked at her reflection in the glass. The infrastructure collapse was not the end of the story. It was the demolition phase, and the new structure was already rising in the dark. She touched the obsidian lily. The diamond was cold. The black stone was hard. Sterling had tried to use the police to silence her. He had succeeded in giving her an armed escort to the one place where he couldn't lie. The judicial trap was waiting. The car pulled away, screaming toward the courthouse. Dr. Seraphina Vane closed her eyes. She needed to prepare her opening statement. It was time to explain to the world who really owned the city. The hallway of the district courthouse felt like a throat, narrow, cold, and closing in. The walls were made of polished Vermont marble, a stone that didn't just hold the chill, it radiated it. The air carried the heavy, oppressive scent of old paper, lemon oil, and the metallic tang of centuries-old institutional power. Dr. Seraphina Vane walked through the double doors of courtroom for B. Her heels did not click. They made a soft, authoritative thud on the hardwood. She was a vision of mahogany skin and absolute structural integrity. Her sculpted architectural bun was a masterpiece of tension. Her facial structure was a geometry of resolve. She wore her charcoal blazer, the structured shoulders cutting through the dim, midnight air of the emergency session. Underneath, the cream silk of her blouse was the only light in the room. On her left lapel, the Obsidian Lily Brooch was a silent witness. The matte black volcanic stone absorbed the flickering fluorescent lights, but the canary diamond at its center was a piercing, golden spark. It was the eye of the storm. Sterling Sterling-Howe IV was already there. He sat at the prosecution table, surrounded by 6 lawyers who looked like they were carved from the same piece of expensive gray wool. He didn't look like a man whose building was dark. He looked like a man who was about to enjoy an execution. His silver hair shimmered under the court lights. He leaned back, whispering something to his lead counsel, a man named Holloway. They both laughed, a low, brittle sound that echoed off the high ceilings. Seraphina sat at the defense table. Alone, she didn't have a team of lawyers. She didn't have a briefcase full of lies. She had a single manila folder. She felt the coldness of the chair through her blazer. She felt the weight of the moment. Inside her mind, she wasn't thinking about the arrest. She wasn't thinking about the headlines. She was thinking about the concept of jurisprudence. The idea that the law is a structure, and if the foundation is rotten, the whole building must come down. All rise. The bailiff's voice was a tired, bored rasp. Judge Silas Beaumont entered from the side door. He was a man made of shadows and silence. His black robes trailed behind him like a shroud. He moved with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who knew the outcome of a trial before the first word was spoken. Beaumont had a reputation. He was the founding judge of the elite. His family had been on the bench for 3 generations. He was a man who believed in the preservation of the status quo. More specifically, he believed in the preservation of the Sterling-Howe legacy. He sat down, his gray eyes scanning the room. He didn't look at Sterling. He didn't need to. The check had already cleared. Dr. Vane, Beaumont said. His voice was like dry parchment rubbing together. We are here because Aegis Global has filed for an emergency injunction to lift your so-called maintenance stay. They are claiming economic terrorism. They are claiming that you are using a dormant 1920 easement to hold the city's commerce hostage. He leaned forward, the shadows deepening in the hollows of his cheeks. The court finds your actions highly irregular. Your interpretation of the Sovereign Infrastructure Act is creative, but potentially criminal. Before I sign the order to have you remanded to federal custody, do you have anything to say? Sterling smirked. He tapped his pen against the table. A rhythmic, annoying sound. He was waiting for her to beg. He was waiting for her to offer a deal. Seraphina stood up. She didn't look at Sterling. She didn't look at the lawyers. She looked directly at Judge Beaumont. Her mahogany skin was matte, flawless. Her high-arched brows were set in a line of absolute, unwavering focus. She reached up and touched the Obsidian Lily Brooch. The cold stone was a grounding force. She felt the canary diamond, a hard, unyielding truth under her fingertip. Your Honor, Seraphina began. Her voice was a low, rich contralto. It didn't shake. It didn't plead. It was a statement of fact. The law is not a creative exercise. It is a historical record. You speak of economic terrorism. I speak of fiduciary duty. She opened her folder. She pulled out a single, yellowed sheet of paper. It was encased in a plastic sleeve. The edges were frayed. The ink was faded, but the seal at the bottom was unmistakable. Sterling leaned forward, trying to see the document. His smirk flickered. "This is not the 1920 easement," Seraphina said. She walked toward the bench. The bailiff stepped forward to intercept her. But Beaumont raised a hand. "Let her approach," Beaumont whispered. His eyes were locked on the paper. Seraphina placed the document on the mahogany bench, directly in front of the judge. "This is a 1964 notice of escapement," Seraphina said. The room went silent. The air seemed to vanish. Sterling whispered to Holloway, "What is she doing?" Judge Beaumont didn't answer. He reached out. His hand was trembling, just a fraction of an inch. He picked up the document. It was a record of a land transfer in the West End. A plot of land that had belonged to the Vane family since the 1800s. In 1964, the city had moved to seize the land through a process of escapement, claiming there were no living heirs. "The clerk who signed that notice," Seraphina said. Her voice was like a blade of ice, "was your father." Marcus Beaumont. The judge's face turned the color of ashdot, "and the man who purchased that land for $10 an acre." Seraphina continued. "Was Sterling Sterling-Howe IV. She leaned in, her eyes burning with a dark, ancient fire. "Your father didn't just sign a notice, Judge. He committed inheritance sabotage. He knowingly falsified the death certificates of my grandparents to clear the title for Sterling's grandfather." Sterling stood up. "This is irrelevant. This is a 50-year-old grievance." "It is a constructive trust," Seraphina countered, her voice rising, filling the courtroom until the marbles seemed to hum. "Under the law of equity, if a property is obtained through fraud, a constructive trust is automatically created for the benefit of the rightful owners, no matter how much time has passed." She looked back at Beaumont. "This document proves that the very ground your family home sits on, Judge, is a fruit of a poisonous tree. It proves that the Beaumont wealth and the Sterling-Howe empire are built on a foundation of systemic theft." She reached into her folder and pulled out a second document. "This is the original sovereign deed. It was never canceled. It was never legally transferred. It has been sitting in a ghost trust in the city archives for 60 years. Judge Beaumont looked at the document. Then he looked at Seraphina. He saw the Obsidian Lily Brooch. He saw the canary diamond. He realized that this woman wasn't just an architect. She was a ghost who had come back to collect a debt. He looked at Sterling. Sterling was shouting now, red-faced, demanding that the documents be struck from the record. But Beaumont wasn't listening to Sterling anymore. He was looking at his own career, his own legacy. If these documents were entered into the public record, the Beaumont name would be synonymous with fraud. He would be stripped of his robes. His family's assets would be frozen. Seraphina watched him. She knew exactly what he was thinking. She had calculated his fear the same way she calculated the stress on a load-bearing wall. "Judge," Seraphina said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "you have two choices. You can sign the injunction, and I will hand these documents to the federal prosecutor who is currently waiting in the hallway. Or you can find that Aegis Global has no standing to challenge the maintenance. Stay. You can order a full audit of the 1964 transfers, and you can save what is left of your family's honor by doing the right thing. For once in your life, Sterling-Howe is a sinking ship." Seraphina said, "Are you going to drown with him?" Sterling slammed his fist onto the table. "Beaumont, do your job." Judge Beaumont slowly picked up his gavel. He didn't look at Sterling. He looked at the 1964 notice of escapement. He looked at the signature of his father. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a structure about to collapse. "The court," Beaumont began. His voice was cracked, hollow. "Finds that the defendant has presented compelling evidence of a pre-existing claim. The emergency injunction is denied. He hit the gavel. The sound was like a bone snapping. A full audit of the Aegis Global Land titles is hereby ordered. Sterling fell back into his chair. He looked like he had been struck. His silver hair was disheveled. His mouth hung open. The elite guests in the gallery began to whisper. A low, frantic sound. They realized the wind had changed. The protection was gone. Seraphina Vane slowly picked up her documents. She placed them back into her folder with a quiet, deliberate precision. She turned to leave. She walked past Sterling's table. She didn't stop. She didn't look at him, but as she passed, she felt the canary diamond on her brooch flare in the light. Sterling Sterling-Howe IV sat in the dark courtroom. He was surrounded by his lawyers, but he was entirely alone. The judicial trap had closed, and for the first time in his life, he was the one on the wrong side of the bars. Seraphina walked out into the lobby. The rain was still falling, but the air felt clean, that the foundation of the elite had been exposed. Now it was time for the final signature. The clock on the wall of the executive penthouse didn't tick. It glided. A silent, gold-plated movement that marked the death of an empire in milliseconds. The air was cold, stripped of its humidity by the industrial-grade filtration system. It smelled of ozone, expensive ink, and the sharp, acrid scent of a man who had run out of lies. Dr. Seraphina Vane sat behind the massive desk. She was a silhouette of absolute, mahogany precision. Her sculpted architectural bun was a crown of discipline, every hair held in place by a will that refused to bend. She wore a charcoal blazer that seemed to absorb the dim light of the room underneath. Her cream silk blouse glowed like a pearl in the deep ocean on her left lapel. The Obsidian Lily Brooch was a dark, volcanic anchor. The matte black stone looked like a frozen shadow, but the canary diamond at its center was a piercing golden eye. It watched the man standing across the desk with a cold, unwavering judgment. Sterling Sterling-Howe IV did not look like the king of the city anymore. His silver hair was disheveled, sticking out at odd angles. His navy cashmere sweater was bunched at the shoulders. His eyes were bloodshot, the pupils blown wide with the frantic energy of a cornered animal. He stood in the center of the rug, his hand shaking. He looked at the Aegis Global Tower through the window. It was still dark, a hollowed-out rib cage of glass and steel. Every minute the maintenance stay remained in place. Aegis was losing $4 million in automated trade cancellations. Their credit default swaps were triggering. Their board was in a state of open mutiny, Seraphina, Sterling whispered. His voice was a cracked, brittle shell of its former self. You've had your fun. You've shown me your teeth. Now, lift the stay. My investors are calling for my head. The banks are ready to freeze my personal accounts. Seraphina didn't answer immediately. She reached out and touched the Obsidian Lily Brooch. Her fingers were long, steady. The touch of the cold volcanic stone was a reminder of the foundation, the earth beneath the ego. She felt the rhythmic throb of her own pulse. A calm 60 beat per minute meter. Sterling, she said. Her voice was a low, rich velvet. You speak of investors and banks as if they were gods. You forgot the only god that matters in this city. She leaned forward. The moonlight caught the sharp, symmetrical lines of her face, the ground. She pulled a single, heavy sheet of vellum from her folder. It was a sovereign deed transfer. A document that didn't just move property, it moved history. You want the power turned back on, Sterling? You want the maintenance stay lifted before the market opens in Tokyo? She placed a fountain pen on the desk. It was a bespoke instrument, crafted from black ebony and gold. Sign the St. Jude Medical Wing back to the Vane Foundation. Not as a lease, not as a donation. Sign it as a fee, simple, absolute transfer. Give back the land your grandfather stole in 1964. Sterling looked at the pen. He looked at the document. This is suicide. If I sign this, I'm admitting the 1964 escapement was fraudulent. You are admitting the truth. Seraphina corrected him. And in exchange, I will sign the release for the utility easements. I will allow the grid to return to normal. You save your company, Sterling. You keep your tower. You keep your navy sweaters. Sterling's chest was heaving. He looked at the clock. It was 3:42 a.m. in 18 minutes. The technical default on his sovereign bonds would become permanent. Give me the pen, he hissed. Seraphina pushed the document toward him. She watched his hand. The skin was pale, thin, the hand of a man who had never laid a brick in his life. Sterling grabbed the pen. He scribbled his signature across the bottom of the deed transfer. The ink was a deep, lustrous blue. It looked permanent. It looked like a victory now, he said. Tossing the pen onto the desk, sign the release. Lift the stay. Seraphina picked up the deed transfer. She examined the signature. Sterling Sterling-Howe IV. The strokes were jagged, aggressive, full of a hatred that he couldn't hide. She placed a second document on the desk. This was the global release of liability. The paper Sterling had tried to trick her into signing at the library. The document that would protect him from all future litigation. I'll sign this, Seraphina said, but only with my own pen. She pulled a small silver vial from her blazer pocket. She unscrewed the cap and filled a separate pen. The fluid inside was a specialized, high-density archival ink, or so it seemed. She signed the release. Her signature was a work of art. Dr. Seraphina Vane. The lines were fluid, connected. Strong dots. Sterling snatched the release from the desk. He didn't even wait for the ink to dry. He pulled his phone from his pocket and called his head of operations. The stay is lifted, he shouted into the phone. I have this signed release. Turn the power back on. All of it. He looked at Seraphina. A flicker of his old arrogance returned to his eyes. He straightened his sweater. You got your dirt, Seraphina, but I have the release. You can never sue me. You can never bring up the ghost ledgers. You can never touch Aegis Global again. You're done. Seraphina stood up. She didn't look at him. She looked at the signature on the deed transfer. Sterling, she said, you should really learn more about the materials you use. What are you talking about? Seraphina reached for the pen Sterling had used. The ebony and gold one. This pen wasn't filled with archival ink. It was filled with a photolable synthetic fluid. 'Tis a chemical compound used by high-end security auditors to test the integrity of digital scans. She pointed at the deed. Transfer on the desk. Sterling looked down. His signature was there. But as the blue light of the morning sun began to creep over the horizon, the ink began to change. It didn't just fade. It turned into a pale, ghostly gray. Then it vanished. Sterling's eyes went wide. He grabbed the paper. He shook it as if he could make the ink reappear. What did you do? He screamed. This is fraud. This is a voided contract. Actually, Seraphina said. Her voice was as cold as a mountain peak. The deed transfer you signed for me was the one with the permanent ink. I switched the pens when you looked at the clock. She pointed to the release in his hand. The document you are holding, the one that protects you from the law, is the one with the disappearing fluid? Sterling looked at the release in his hand. He watched in frozen horror as his own signature and Seraphine's began to dissolve. The blue ink turned into a faint mist. Then the page was blank. He was holding a piece of paper that meant nothing. He had signed the land over to her on a permanent, irrevocable document. But the protection he thought he bought, the immunity he needed to survive the audit, it was gone. In 5 minutes. The power will return to your tower, Seraphina said. She walked toward the door, but the audit team is already in the lobby. Sterling, and since you no longer have a signed release of liability, they are going to use every single entry in those ghost ledgers to dismantle your life. She stopped at the threshold. She looked back at him. One final time, the mahogany of her skin was glowing in the dawn. The Obsidian Lily Brooch was a dark flame on her lapel. You thought you were buying my knee. Silence. Sterling. You were actually buying a frontra. Seat to your own foreclosure, Sterling. Fell to his knees in the middle of the dark room. He looked at the blank paper in his hands. He looked at the sun rising over a city that no longer belonged to him. The lights in the tower began to flicker, one by one. The floors roared back to life. The power was back. But Sterling Sterling-Howe IV was in total darkness. Seraphina Vane walked out of the building. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The foundation was restored. The final signature had been written. And the ink of the elite had finally run dry. The sun rose over the city, not as a bruised orange, but as a sharp, golden blade that cut through the remaining morning mist. The air was crisp, tasted of ozone and the scent of freshly turned earth. It was the smell of a new foundation being laid. Dr. Seraphina Vane stood on the limestone steps of the St. Jude wing. She was a statue of mahogany, grace, and absolute, unshakable power. Her skin was a matte, deep mahogany that seemed to glow in the early light. Her hair was styled in its signature sculpted architectural bun, every strand locked into a geometry of triumph. She wore a bespoke, charcoal wool coat over a cream silk blouse. The fabric was heavy, substantial, the uniform of a woman who no longer had to ask for permission. On her left lapel, the Obsidian Lily Brooch anchored her to the world. The matte black petals did not reflect the morning sun. They absorbed it, but the canary diamond at its center was a blazing, golden star. It caught the light and threw it back at the world like a challenge. It was the only thing in the city that looked more permanent than the buildings surrounding it. Behind her, the scaffolding was coming down. The St. Jude wing had not been demolished. It had been reborn under the sovereign deed protocols Seraphina had unearthed. The land had reverted to the original grantors. Estate the moment Sterling Sterling-Howe IV attempted to change its use Seraphina as the sole heir to the Ghost Trust. Had not kept the land for herself. She had gifted it back to the city. Under one condition, the wing would no longer be just a veterans clinic. It was now the new Metropolitan City Hall by moving the seat of government into the structure. Seraphina had created a legal paradox that Sterling could never solve. Under the city charter, a building housing the mayor's office and the city council is designated as a sovereign sanctuary. It is immune to corporate litigation. It cannot be seized. It cannot be foreclosed upon. And it can never be bulldozed by a private interest. She had used the very systems Sterling loved to build a fortress around her. Legacy? Seraphina looked down at the crowd gathered on the plaza. There were no elite developers, no fourth-generation predators in cashmere sweaters. There were veterans, nurses, archivists, and ordinary citizens who finally had a roof that wasn't leaking with corruption. She felt the cold weight of the obsidian lily against her chest. Her pulse was a slow, deep rhythm. It was the heartbeat of a building that was meant to stand for 1,000 years. She thought about her late mentor. She thought about the 1964 escapement. She thought about the decades of silence her family had endured. The silence was over. Seraphina turned her gaze toward the black sedan parked at the edge of the plaza. The windows were tinted, but she knew who was inside. Sterling Sterling-Howe IV sat in the back of the transport vehicle. He was not wearing cashmere today. He was wearing a Standa tissue, orange jumpsuit. His silver hair was thin, matted against his forehead. His skin looked like gray parchment. He was handcuffed to the doorframe. His eyes were fixed on the limestone steps. Sterling watched through the reinforced glass partition. He saw the woman he had tried to erase. He saw her standing in the light, surrounded by the people he had spent his life stepping over. He looked at the St. Jude wing. The building he had called a public hazard was beautiful. It was strong. It was the seat of power in the city he used to own. Sterling reached out with a shaking hand. He touched the glass. The cold surface was the only thing he had left. He was currently facing 42 counts of fiduciary fraud, 12 counts of institutional sabotage, and a federal racketeering charge that carried a mandatory life sentence. His assets had been seized under the Civil Forfeiture Act. His tower was being liquidated by a court-appointed receiver. His family name was being chiseled off the walls of every museum and library in the tri-state area. He was a man who had built his life on debt, and the debt had finally come due. Sterling watched as Seraphina reached out and cut the ribbon. The crowd erupted in a sound that was louder than any demolition charge. Sterling closed his eyes, but he couldn't block out the sound. He couldn't block out the reality that he was now a ghost in his own city. Seraphina Vane did not look at the sedan as it pulled away. She did not need to see his face. She had already mapped his descent. She walked into the cool marble lobby of the new city hall. Her heels made a steady, authoritative thud on the floor. She stopped at the center of the rotunda. She looked up at the dome. The architecture was perfect. The load-bearing walls were true. The foundation was sovereign. She reached up and touched the Obsidian Lily Brooch. She felt the canary diamond. It was warm. It felt like a heartbeat that the Matriarch did not build for the moment. She built for the history. Seraphina Vane walked toward her new office. The doors opened before she even arrived. The era of the elite was finished. The sovereign. Dawn had arrived, and the architect was finally home. The city hummed around her. A rhythmic, living machine. Sterling Sterling-Howe IV was a footnote in a textbook on failure. Seraphina Vane was the city itself. She sat down at her new desk. It was made of solid mahogany. She picked up a pen. The ink was permanent. She began to sign the first order of the new administration. The foundation was set. The structure was rising, and this time it would never fall. The lights of the city flickered once. A greeting. The Matriarch will always